Hi, I'm firearms attorney Gilbert Ambler, and I'm back today to talk about the folks who have already had their gun rights restored pursuant to 18 U.S.C. 925C at the federal level. And of course, these folks, there were 9 of them thus far that have been published in the Federal Register. And that means that the federal government is starting to issue these restorations. We're going to talk about what a petition should look like if you want to petition the federal government to have your rights restored. And we're going to talk about what types of folks are probably the best candidates for a federal gun rights restoration. As always, however, before we dive into this subject, if you have not yet hit that subscribe button, what are you waiting for? Hit subscribe, like, comment with your thoughts, share with your friends. That way you and your friends can keep getting this important Second Amendment related content. Now, everyone knew that Mel Gibson got his gun rights restored recently, headlines all over. What about the other folks? And of course, the process that Mel Gibson had his rights restored through was 18 U.S.C. 925C, which is a mechanism for a federal restoration of gun rights. We talked about this in a prior video. Very good news because 925C had been defunded. ATF had been in charge of processing them, and ATF had been prohibited from processing them since 1991. However, as of this year, Attorney General Pam Bondi has revoked the authority to the ATF, and the DOJ is now processing these federal rights restorations. Now, we talked about this in a prior video. This is great news for folks that have either been federally convicted and otherwise would have had to pursue a pardon or an as-applied challenge to get their rights back. This is also great news for folks that have state convictions if their state doesn't give them a option for restoration. So a lot of times that might be misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. It might be in a state that has no process for restoring rights for those convicted of felonies, for example, at the state level. They can pursue this federal restoration. The other thing I want to remind everybody about is just because you get a federal restoration doesn't mean states are going to recognize it, so you still need to be cautious if there's something you need to do at the state level to ensure that you're eligible to own firearms. Now, the 9 folks that had their rights granted already by the federal government, their names are listed in the Federal Register. It was published on April 29th of this year of 2025. What do they all have in common? What they all have in common, as far as I can tell, is it doesn't appear that they actually applied specifically for a gun rights restoration. Instead, these were folks who applied for a pardon, and somehow the Department of Justice put them on a list and considered them, and in fact granted them a gun rights restoration. Now, there's a couple of famous names on the list, Mel Gibson probably being the most famous, Joe Klecko of Jets fame, but several of these folks are not famous. In fact, if you Google them, several of them really you can't find any results for. I understand that a lot of them were decades-old convictions for often nonviolent crimes like banking-related fraud and falsifying board of directors records for a bank, things like that were not violent felonies. So if you are looking at federal gun rights restoration, what things should you be thinking about? First thing that we can probably rule out is recent violent convictions. This is both felony and misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. If they're recent violent related convictions, even if you think you didn't do anything that deserved a conviction, unfortunately, these petitions are not an opportunity to relitigate what led to your conviction in the first place. So, you got convicted from a jury of a violent sounding crime. Even if you did not do it, and you maintain that you did not do it, the federal rights restoration process is not the opportunity to argue you did not do it. And unfortunately, if it was a recent violent conviction, and when I say recent, I mean probably within the past 10 years, probably not a great candidate for rights restoration. And I understand there's going to be people in the comments, I know there's going to be people in the comments that don't like that say, hey, if I'm free from incarceration, I should have my rights. I don't disagree with you. I'm just telling you from a practical perspective, the DOJ is going to be inundated with requests to restore gun rights, and I don't think they're likely to consider violent convictions from within the past 10 years. And as I said, this is not an opportunity to relitigate what you were convicted of. That would be a different forum, a different cause of action. Instead, when you're filing one of these petitions, it's really about setting yourself apart now from who you were at the time of the conviction and then demonstrating why you are not a danger and why you should not be perceived as a danger, why the Department of Justice shouldn't be concerned that you might do something violent in the future. And there's a couple of ways to do this. First is obviously, if you had a nonviolent conviction, that's helpful. That's a helpful starting place. So you had some type of theft or fraud or something that was essentially a paperwork crime, like Brian Range, who had the as-applied challenge up in the Third Circuit. Now, that was a court challenge, not a petition for rights restoration, but Brian Range won that case because he was nonviolent. And essentially they said, nonviolent, not likely to act dangerous. In that situation, 922G1 was unconstitutional as applied to Brian Range. We're trying to do the same thing as you would do in an as-applied challenge with the petition. So again, you're going through the executive branch, you're not going through the judicial branch, but you're saying, as applied to this particular individual, this is not somebody who we should be worried about. So strong starting point if you've got a nonviolent conviction. Second thing you want to do is you want to show how your life has changed since the time of the conviction. So if you are now married and you own your own house and you own a business and you've done all of the right things and you've stayed free of arrest, free of prosecution since the conviction, that's going to be helpful. You want to set yourself apart and show how your life is different, and maybe even explain what was going on in your life at the time of the conviction that led you astray and how you are living and acting differently at this point. And then finally, you're probably going to want to rely on support from those who know you well. If you can get police officers, other government officials, people that would be trusted sources to write notarized character letters supporting you in your quest to have gun rights restored, that will also be helpful. My firm has started to file these petitions. That's Ambler Law Offices. You can find us online. We are filing these petitions for folks at this point. We're putting together, we've got packages where we help you source the appropriate materials, help you get documentation together, and we can start filing these petitions. So if you're interested in gun rights restoration, my advice is don't wait too long, because as we said, the DOJ is certainly getting inundated with requests. I've already talked to people who have filed their own petitions, pro se petitions. I don't know this. I have nothing factual to back this up other than to say, I suspect you are less likely to have your petition looked at, reviewed, and granted if it's in an unprofessional pro se format. I think that you're going to probably do better with law office letterhead and coming from a lawyer, laying out the applicable legal standards and in a very professional package. So that is something that we offer folks. As I said, it doesn't have to be us. You can find lawyers, across the country that do gun rights restoration. But I do think now is a good time to act before they get totally inundated or before the political winds shift and they stop processing these and stop looking for them and it becomes politically unpopular for some reason. Why would it become politically unpopular? All it's going to take is one person who has had their rights restored doing something stupid, the media making big headlines about it, for it to become unpopular again. So my advice, act now while they are still looking at and considering these federal gun rights restorations. And as I said, you also should be talking to a lawyer to consider state-based ramifications. If you enjoyed this content, hit subscribe. Until next time.